Afternoon. Welcome to Carnegie Endowment. My name is Doug Paul, and you'll see at your places bios of me and our speaker today, Christine Lowe. So I won't go into great detail, but I want to thank you all for coming out on a beautiful Washington day. We have a pretty high percentage of people who said they would show up who have shown up, and as I see your faces, I realize why, because you're the dedicated core of the China and Hong Kong watchers here in Washington. And I want to welcome you all. Many of you are good friends or soon will be, and I want to thank you for joining us and coming to listen to the thoughts and opinions and suggestions of Christine Lowe. As you'll see from the biography, she's running civic exchange these days in Hong Kong after a very successful career as lawyer, commodity trader, and politician. She's we're lucky to have her here today. Bob Keatley, who publishes the Hong Kong Journal, put us together for this event and helped with the lunch arrangements. And he asked me, and I want to make sure I get this right, to make mention of the fact that you can get other opinions by Christine and other people who follow Hong Kong affairs very much in detail if you turn to their website, which is very simply the www.hkjournal.org. The Hong Kong Journal website will give you access to a tremendous amount of information. It's been my observation, I don't think it's completely wrong, that Hong Kong has dropped a bit off the radar screen in Washington. And as one of our guests today pointed out, sometimes it's a good thing to drop off Washington's radar screen, but sometimes it's not. And I think in this case, we're really lucky to have Christine come to speak with us today to bring us up to date on what's happening. She has graciously sent along a couple of copies of two of her new books. She and Karine Lai produced volumes on the Reflections of Leadership, Dong Xihua and Donald Tsang, and From Nowhere to Nowhere, a review of constitutional development in Hong Kong since 1997, when the Special Administrative Region reverted to Chinese sovereignty. In the 12 years since then, Hong Kong has really been through a lot. I'm not going to jump ahead and steal any of Christine's remarks, just to note that they started off with the collapse of the Asian currencies, starting with the baht, immediately followed by bird flu and a few hard years. Hong Kong's come a long way financially since then, and I look forward to hearing from you, Christine, about how Hong Kong has done in the other departments concerned. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thank you very much, Douglas, for the invitation to come. I thought what I'd do is maybe just spend maybe the main body of the talk just to give you a sense of politically where we are, because, of course, that will give you a context into what are some of the economic issues, as Hong Kong also tries to determine what's our next phase of growth. There is continually more interest in how Hong Kong should interact, perhaps integrate with Guangdong province, how that is proceeding. So we can talk about that a little later. But what I thought I would do is just to perhaps bring us all up to date about where the politics is. I want to start off by reminding ourselves what is the One Country, Two Systems project. And then I want to go into a little bit of the details about the specifics of the project and how that impacts on decision making, because that's what we're talking about. We're talking about whether Hong Kong, our leaders, how they're making decisions to take Hong Kong forward. And then the last part of the talk, I want to just share some reflections with you. Where are we now, and how might we go forward as a part of one country? So let me start and talk a little bit about the One Country, Two Systems project. I know all of you are familiar with Hong Kong, but maybe it's just a good idea to try to frame this. Well, you will remember the One Country, Two Systems formula was an innovation from Beijing to keep everybody feeling reasonably confident as we go through a tremendous political transition. So first of all, the message for the world and the message to the people of Hong Kong is your way of life is essentially secure. So that was a very important message for the world. We could feel that whilst there's a tremendous political transition, and it was at a time when China was still in the early stage of emerging from the Cultural Revolution period. They started to negotiate with the UK the Sino-British Joint Declaration only in 1982. So that was just a few years after China adopted its open door policy. So that was a time when we all felt quite differently about China. How is China going to absorb this capitalist, highly active city? As far as the UK was concerned, one country, two systems was essential to sell the idea to its own people and to the world that this could work, that Britain can discharge her responsibility towards the people of Hong Kong. And the one thing Britain needed to secure that sense of honor is for Hong Kong to begin to have elections. So one country, two systems. It also embodied an election system that the Western world could identify with. Thirdly, as far as Beijing was concerned, that's what it's going to take to allow a corner of China to operate very differently. That was what it was going to take for China to take power peacefully. So that's also something Beijing wanted. So that's the one country, two systems project, looking at it from three different perspectives. Now, the consequences of framing it this way was, first of all, whilst a lot of Hong Kong people decided they wanted an insurance policy, many people stayed in Hong Kong. People who went away, some of them also decided to come back. Secondly is, as far as the British were concerned, the fact that we had elections, that they were able to depart with a facade of honor. So this worked for them, as long as there was a degree of moving towards a more democratic system. And thirdly, as far as China was concerned, well, first of all, they had to deal with elections. It wasn't something that China felt completely comfortable with, but having agreed to it, they started to have to think about how they were going to have to deal with it. Secondly was they had a strategy. The strategy was to make sure that the elites in Hong Kong who were loyal to Britain would transfer their loyalty to Beijing. Thirdly, the mechanism for doing that was to roll out something called a United Front policy. This is a massive propaganda campaign or public relations campaign. Right? How do we, the Chinese, at the time when people still had many fresh negative memories, how do we bring the elites on board so that this one country, two systems project could proceed? Well, I think today it's fair to say that all sides could claim some success. As I said, Hong Kong is stable and prosperous. We weathered the Asian financial crisis pretty well. Now we're going into a new phase of a much more extensive global crisis, but so far so good. What we learned from the last Asian financial crisis is Hong Kong, by nature, we are a fairly stable community. We have a lot to lose. Instability for us is not something I think ordinary Hong Kong people really want. They have to be pretty upset to drive them to protest. But having said that, of course, I'll come back to this point, it's not like we don't know how to protest. But on the whole, we don't want to do it. We don't want to upset the apple cart. We have a nice apple cart. We like Hong Kong. We want change, but we don't want to upset everything. Secondly is, the British were able to leave with a degree of honor. They had Chris Patten, who, as far as the Western world was concerned, he tried to push for democracy. But of course, it's now more than 10 years after the transition, they could say, okay, at that moment in time, it was a success. From Beijing's point of view, it's got to be a success. You can't have a major national policy and it doesn't work. The Chinese also had a certain understanding of the necessity to keep their hands off Hong Kong. Now, this doesn't mean they weren't interested in Hong Kong. This doesn't mean that they didn't feel that they didn't have control of Hong Kong. But they made a specific point of not being visibly messing around. And you will remember the creation of the Hong Kong-Macau Affairs Office, and Jiang Zemin's policy was to have this body as a kind of gatekeeper. Provincial heads, party heads, municipal heads, department heads, ministry heads, they couldn't directly interfere in Hong Kong because they had to go through the Hong Kong-Macau Affairs Office. So this was designed by the top leaders at the time to provide a kind of buffer. If other departments and regions, if they wanted to deal with Hong Kong, they go through a high-level office in Beijing. So that was the game, right? That was how it was to be. Now, the one point that I want to go back to is this project, One Country, Two Systems, and the one element that was also an innovation for both Hong Kong and for Beijing to accept, and that is election. By introducing elections that look like elections here in the United States, it did have, I think, a permanent impact on us. We went and we cast our vote. It's an experiential thing. There are people who try to get our vote. There are important people in society who would offer themselves for election. My mother cast her vote for the first time in 1995. And she voted for me. But nevertheless, in all her time in Hong Kong, she'd never done anything like that. So I could observe her, and actually, my aunties and my uncles, they went and voted for the first time. And there was a kind of excitement there. Now, let me just fast forward and tell you about, again, watching my mother in 2007, because I know you had Alan Leung here, who spoke. Of course, he was the candidate who ran against the chief executive, Donald Tsang. And again, you can see the shift in consciousness in Hong Kong. They had two debates, televised. Those two debates commanded the highest viewership in Hong Kong. And I watched both of them with my mother. She was completely riveted. She's not a political animal. She's not that interested in public policy. She was only interested to the extent that I'm interested. But she sat there and she watched both shows. And for her, there was a sense of elation. Somehow important people were having to answer questions, having to put their views out. So even she could criticize them. The reason that I'm stressing this point is elections have this impact on the community as a whole. And the community quite enjoys it. So it's not just about, how high the voting rates are, for our legislative election. There are enough people who participate and who talk about it that transform society. So even though we had elections without democracy, we have a very special kind of election. It's an election without mandate. And it's election really without winners. Winners in the sense that these people get the mandate to take important decisions. Leaving that aside, the experience of going to the ballot box was something that Hong Kong people genuinely and enthusiastically took on board. Now, as far as the UK was concerned, in 1985, when we had our first election of first few seats to the Legislative Council, it was not direct election. It was something called functional constituencies. And I know you all know enough about what this is. This model of allowing people, the British authorities would have appointed, but instead of appointing them, you now have to elect them. So they created this animal called the functional constituency as an election system. So this allows them to elect essentially the elites. And to do that, not only are humans allowed to vote, even companies are allowed to vote. Now, I won't go into the details of this, because I think when I was here last time, that's what I spoke about. But this kind of election, now that we have seen it since 1985, we have a reasonable understanding of the impact of functional elections. It essentially entrenches certain interest in the political system, and that these interests obviously want to stay around. They're essentially conservative in nature, conservative meaning they don't want change. And after so many years, they can even be troublesome for the government because they don't want the system to be changed. So I'll come back to this in a minute. The problem with giving half your seats to this kind of election is that it's extremely difficult for the government to have the kind of legitimacy they desire. Because generally the public sees functional elections as iffy, as suspect. It's not fair, because certain groups, certain functional groups, most of them represented big business, their interest is entrenched in the political system. So you can see the ordinary people, particularly when they witness certain policies, you just can't change them, even when the government wants to change them. They see this as the price the community has to pay for the kind of democracy that we have. So the problem for the government is, even when it's really critical, they need certain things passed, they'll squeeze the pro-government camp to support them. And yet, it's sometimes some things that everybody does relatively unwillingly. It is just the system designed in such a way that you're supposed to be, if you're in the pro-government camp, you're supposed to support the government, and you will support the government on all the important things, but you do it extremely unwillingly. This is how we share power in Hong Kong. And it makes for a lot of frustration. So as I said, by introducing elections, the people get quite energized. The political actors don't really feel they have the power, even after they win elections. And it's constant having to support things that people don't necessarily want to support. Right? So it creates a high level of frustration. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is, how do you go forward on this kind of system? Which is why, of course, there's always a strong line of argument in Hong Kong that you've got to change this. And by changing this, is it about full democracy? Well, obviously, there's a strong sense that that's what people want. But also, what we have is, we have Beijing also making its view quite clear. Beijing is not yet ready for a fully democratic system where the leaders that are chosen by the people, they're the ones who take power. So we're now talking about in Hong Kong whether it's possible for the chief executive to be directly elected. So the direct election would have to, in a way, there has to be a buffer, and that's going to be through some kind of nominating system. So you have to create a nominating committee. The kind of nominating committee that might come about would be, again, maybe not dissimilar to the functional system that we have, right? So this is what Hong Kong is struggling through. When we get to elect our chief executive, what is the nominating committee going to look like? Now, and it's only after having done that, would it be possible for Beijing to consider electing the legislature? Of course, in the last year, and you know this here, Beijing has also made it clear that whatever system is going to happen next, the legislature will still be the non-dominant institution. And in our language in Hong Kong, it's going to be an executive-led system. That means the power would still be rooted in the executive. So even with a fully directly elected legislature, the power will still be vested essentially in the executive. Question mark. How do we do this going forward? And what really will the politics be? If you have a fully directly elected legislature, then, you know, what is the dynamics? And I think until those things have been worked out, we're probably not going to see the legislature being fully directed. So question mark here. Election, of course, as an issue, never goes off the political table in Hong Kong. And I think a part of that is because Hong Kong ordinary people feel very comfortable with election. We want more whenever we are able to persuade Beijing that we can get more. Now, so that's one side of the Hong Kong itch, the itch for legitimacy. Right? So the people want to vote, but also the government itself. The Hong Kong SAR government, it knows, its leader knows that one thing that it's lacking for them is that ultimate political legitimacy. That doesn't mean we don't respect our government officials. That doesn't mean we don't think the Hong Kong SAR government is a good government. It's just that this disconnection between the people and the government, how do you cure this? Now, on the mainland, the answer is the government will give the people what they want. Right? We can deliver cleaner government, we can deliver better decisions, we can deliver a strong economy. So in a way, Hong Kong too has adopted that kind of attitude. Whilst we're not elected directly by the people, it is nevertheless a government that functions. Now, so we're now back to this issue of what it is that the government needs to deliver in policy terms on a day-to-day basis. And you know what that means here. We are talking about whether we can do it. And the people in Hong Kong, being very practical, are looking at policies on a day-to-day basis and asking, are you solving problems? And this is where we do have a lot of argument here. And a lot of the argument goes to the root of certain ideologies and assumptions. And Hong Kong is also plugged into the big discussions that is going around the world about taxes, about how do we restructure our healthcare system, how do we pay for better education, how do we clean up the environment, so all these issues. And how a government anywhere decides on this, a lot of it has to do with their fundamental core belief about the kind of policies that work. If you look at the outcome of certain policies of the past, including during colonial times, we have to ask, why is it that we have a more serious income disparity and wealth disparity problem than we did in the past? What are some of the policies that have been put in place where we have not been able to bring the disadvantage further up that income and wealth ladder? So these are the kind of issues that resonate in the community. These are the issues that our government have found it quite difficult to deal with because despite our enormous public wealth. We've spent a lot on infrastructure, but it's been very difficult to spend money on welfare issues. Maybe you can recognize some parts of this in the U.S. as well. But, you know, these are the issues that I think every government has to struggle with. Then I'd like to talk a little bit about how perhaps the Chinese government is looking at governing Hong Kong more than a decade after 1997. Well, first of all, we still have an extraordinary situation in Hong Kong where the ruling party, the Chinese Communist Party, continues to be an underground organization. You know, I find it extraordinary because, of course, today it's so easy to go to the mainland. It is possible for me to get on the underground, connect with the train, and go and have dinner in Shenzhen, which I do reasonably often. When I cross the border and I'm in Shenzhen, talking about the Communist Party, you know, whether somebody, an official that I might be dealing with, you know, whether he is a party member. I mean, this is not a secret. I mean, this is something that we can talk about in a relaxed manner. And yet in Hong Kong, the ruling party has, through a long and complicated history, continued to be an organization that doesn't have a legal form. Where do we go from here? And I wonder whether we haven't had some very early signs, very recently, about this issue, how it's being deliberated within the party in China. How long can we continue to, in a way, not acknowledge the ruling party in Hong Kong? And of course also in Macau. Should we continue to do this? And this made me think about the memoirs of Xu Jiatuan, who was one of the pre-97 head of the party, the director of the Xinhua news agency. After he left, he's now currently still living in California. He published a book. And there was a section in there that talked about his views of how the party could operate after 1997. And his view was, well, it should be open. You know, open in the sense that we're here. Communist Party is here. But he said he didn't think certain community-related operations of the party should be open. Now, let's try to understand that in Hong Kong today as to what that means. That would mean the head of the party, who today is the head of the liaison office of the Central People's Government, probably that he could be acknowledged as the head of, or the most senior official there. There would be a party office that one could identify. But of course, the party in Hong Kong has been building the United Front all these years because they had to deal with elections. And it's a common topic of discussion in Hong Kong about how the liaison office, i.e. the party, has to embrace elections, but to make sure that their preferred candidates have a chance of winning. And we saw some of these activities in our last election in September 2008. I won't go into any details for now. So we all know the party is there. We all know the liaison office, that it has this role. And if we also look at the number of people now in Hong Kong, most of these are business, professional, and community leaders, that many of them have been appointed to what in China are called United Front bodies. So this is the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference. There's the national one, and there's also these conferences actually throughout China, in provinces, in major cities, minor cities. So many you can certainly identify a group of people who all have been appointed to some of these bodies. Of course, there are also people from Hong Kong who are appointed to the National People's Congress, the national legislature, as well as regional legislature. So this pool of people, I can't find a list of it anywhere, a full list, but if you watch the news and you look at people's CV, you can build out the extensiveness of these appointments. Within the Chinese political system, this is nothing unusual. This is fully understandable. It's not something to be criticized. But what is perhaps interesting from a research perspective is how this system impacts politically on Hong Kong. So again, when we are thinking about election, when we're thinking about that nominating committee that has to be constructed before Hong Kong can directly elect the chief executive, is it that the nominating committee would essentially be made up of these individuals, whom, of course, Beijing feels comfortable with, because it feels they know these people. So that's one perspective of these appointees. The second one is, again, something that is quite controversial. Recently, there was a news item in Hong Kong reflecting on a particular meeting that took place in March in Beijing during the National People's Congress meetings, where a liaison office official had commented to a group of appointees that they would be given more role, that there was an agreement between them and the Hong Kong government that they would be given more role in activities in Hong Kong. So this was denied when it was put out publicly, but obviously something was going on. Now, one line of explanation is to say, well, these people are acting politically in Hong Kong, so this is just stating the obvious. But of course, if we look at it in institutional terms, my own sense is politically, this is the way it's supposed to work. Whilst these appointees to the CPPCC and the NPC, whilst they are to dedicate their time to mainland affairs, but the fact that they are from Hong Kong, they are in Hong Kong, they obviously have some, in a way, they have some political impact, because they do talk about national affairs, they do talk about Hong Kong political affairs, and this is the group of political appointees that the mainland is most comfortable with. And this is a group of people that is being built up to be part of that circle of trusted individuals to support the Hong Kong SAR government. So this is the kind of relationship that is being established and created and evolving in Hong Kong. So you could say the political side of Hong Kong, the political structure, is taking on aspects that are not so different from the one on the mainland. Now, on the mainland, you have the government, and alongside the government, you actually have the party system. And this is the case in every institution, every area in China. And of course, in China itself, it's the party system that is the predominant system, because policies are made by the party and they're carried out by the government. Now, in Hong Kong, the One Country, Two Systems project, we've never kind of entered into a discussion to say, how is this going to be the same or different as Hong Kong evolves as a part of one country? It was certainly the case in the first 10 years that we don't have this double parallel system. But as we go forward, is this the system that will essentially also evolve? What are the advantages and disadvantages of this system evolving? So I just want to share a few personal reflections with you. Let me talk about the One Country, Two Systems formula. What's not convenient about it? We're now a part of China. But this notion of having a gatekeeper with the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office, it has benefits, but it also has disbenefits. So Hong Kong, within the environment of a fast-changing China, we are disconnected from policy deliberations. We don't have an ear or an eye at the ministry level, at the important institutions in China that are talking about mainland policies. This is something that I think to some extent makes our government, our business people, as well as a sense amongst the 老百姓, the ordinary folks of China, uncomfortable, because we see China moving so fast on so many things. And we're not sure whether we're in for the ride or not. Right? And we were not quite sure whether we're in for the ride. We need our political leaders, our chief executive, to be seemingly running up to China, to Beijing, to ask for favors. So questions like, can we be listing more Chinese companies in Hong Kong? Can we start more RMB businesses in Hong Kong? These issues that requires mainland authorization. It looks like that we're going to Beijing with our cap in hand. Do us a favor. We have the Asian financial crisis. Right now we have another economic crisis. Also, can we have more mainland tourists to come to Hong Kong? These are all reported in the media in a way like we're going there cap in hand. And it makes us feel, that's what we need. Without the mainland supporting us in these very active ways, Hong Kong would be in economic trouble. So there's a lack of analysis of also whether Hong Kong still provides a window for China to test all sorts of things. Well, we know China wants to one day float the RMB. We now know China has even greater ambition, that perhaps the RMB can be a world currency in the future. Having Hong Kong to test things out is really a very good idea. So, it really depends on how you look at it. Is this cap in hand? Or is this also, from the mainland's point of view, a great opportunity to try something out because there is a second system? So, but as I said, very often it gives us a sense that we're not important. It makes us feel not full of confidence. The other problem is this notion that we're disconnected from mainland policies. Again, if we're talking about the financial sector, we get a sense of Hong Kong and Shanghai competing. We get a sense of Hong Kong and Shenzhen competing. We're worried that we're going to lose out because how can Hong Kong, without a Politburo member, ever win against Shanghai? We feel not very confident because we can hardly speak Mandarin properly. How can we go to the mainland and argue our case in a compelling fashion? So I'm saying these are some serious issues that we have to deal with. So what is the mechanism? What is the smart politics that we need to get into so that we can have an ear and an eye when Chinese policymakers are deliberating upon national policies that have an impact on Hong Kong? How do we get there? Who is thinking about these things? Who can help us implement it? So, as I said, these are some very important issues as we go forward. So I think I just want to end by not telling you I have all the answers, because I don't. But I hope you can kind of get a sense of the political context in Hong Kong, the sort of more macro issues in terms of Hong Kong mainland relations that we need to deal with. You get a sense of how the mainland also has to think about some pretty big issues in terms of what they do in Hong Kong. Like, what would it be like if the Communist Party were to say, we're here, here's our office, we're conducting business here? How would it deal with the way that it has always acted, which is in the background? How would that change how Hong Kong people perceive this mainland Hong Kong relations? As I said, I don't have all the answers to this, but this is the kind of discussion Hong Kong is now beginning to enter into. And I hope the US, people who are interested in China affairs and Hong Kong affairs, that you keep an eye on this, because without a doubt, these issues going forward are in fact very important for all of us who want to understand how China is going to evolve. And it is in this little corner of Hong Kong where you can witness and join in the discussion, probably like nowhere else you can on the mainland. Thank you very much.
Well, Christine, thank you very much for bringing a very sophisticated insider's look at Hong Kong and its relationship with the mainland to Washington today. I probably cannot say it's the first time it's ever happened in Washington, but certainly it's the first time in my hearing that we've had a discussion of effective representation in Beijing by Hong Kong and what the prices of that kind of shortcoming represents to the people of Hong Kong. And thank you for bringing that today. We have titles here at Carnegie. One of them is Senior Associate, and to give you some sense of the meaning of that, I was reminded twice by staff to ask you to turn off your BlackBerries and your telephones and things. But I was senior enough to forget that and not mention it earlier on. But I would ask you to do that now before we start the Q&A, because the microphones will roam and they'll pick up your Bluetooth signals off your communicators. And I think that's all the way of announcements. When you are identified, please stand up and identify yourself, your affiliation, and ask a real question.
I'm Howard Wiarda from CSIS and a former, I guess still current, professor of political science. So let me first of all acknowledge a wonderful political science presentation on these themes. That was just terrific, Christine. The question, I have a dozen questions, but I'll just ask once. It really was an interesting presentation. But let me ask you this, in terms of the internal dynamics of Hong Kong politics. This is a familiar issue, as you know, in political science, how an opposition functions within a closed, semi-closed, semi-authoritarian regime. And I wonder if you talked a lot about the dynamics of how this works. What are the outer limits of permissible behavior on both sides? In other words, civil society in Hong Kong clearly wants to make its point of view known, but without provoking a general strike or breakdown or an economic crisis in which it would lose popular support. And the regime in Beijing clearly wants to maintain control while allowing a certain safety valve of emotions to escape in Hong Kong without it being too severe, and at the same time not have to send in the tanks. So tell me, in terms of your experience in your politics, what are the outer limits within which both sides operate here, beyond which they cannot really go, and how that affects the dynamics of the internal politics?
Well, perhaps 1st of July 2003 provides a good reflection point for us in Hong Kong, because that was the moment where we had more than 500,000 people flood out in a peaceful demonstration against the government's imminent passage of what we call the national security legislation. I think the mainland doesn't want to see this happen again, not because it was causing physical disruptions in Hong Kong, But of course, this show of people power can potentially become something quite ugly on the mainland. So after 2003, after this protest, we know, as a matter of public record now, that mainland leaders sent many, many foot soldiers to Hong Kong to try to understand what was going on, and also to determine what might it take to prevent something like that happening again. So really, since then, there has been a more intense period of United Front. United Front, as I said, is a code word for more public relations, more propaganda, more bringing together of elite voices. Because under the United Front umbrella, the belief is that we can get influential people to either not go along with the opposition or to support the pro-government view, then that would be the ultimate guarantee of stability. So that's the purpose. Now, your question is, but what are then the limits within this context? In Hong Kong, I think today we know what are no-go areas. No-go areas is Taiwan and Tibet. That is not for me to say that these are issues Hong Kong people want to deal with. In fact, relatively speaking, I think Hong Kong is not about to whip up trouble in this area. Secondly, then, it's really over policies. And one thing that I've seen just in the last 5 years, and actually even on a month-by-month basis, there are more NGOs being formed in Hong Kong than I can keep track of. And as many of you know, one of my major interest area is the environment. So let me just talk about the kind of groups that I'm seeing coming forward on the environment. I mean, just 2 days ago, there was another group of really young people in their 20s who formed yet another green group. This is a green group that is savvy using IT, and they're going to use IT to go and communicate with other young people to spread the green message. So what I'm saying is there's a whole new generation of people of that sort. Now, this is not usually the kind of people that the United Front would focus on. And for the United Front to actually deal with these people, I think they also have to change their strategy. So what I see that is difficult for the Hong Kong government is, in fact, to deal with this much more energized civil society, and they have to deliver on policy. And part of the problem they can't deliver on policy is because they have this functionally based political system where the vested interest are the ones who can outvote pretty much everything in the legislature. So whilst I don't see a big riot on the horizon, that is what the government always fears. It is also what our top political leaders fear, because if there is a sizable one, how are they going to explain to Beijing? Did they miss something? Were they not able to handle the problem so that, we have several thousand people bursting out onto the streets? So this becomes a kind of an indicator of whether our political leaders are doing well or not. It's very unfortunate. And as I said, luckily, Hong Kong people are not about to go out on the street all the time. But there's a lot of muttering. Hong Kong is not, we're a happy society in the sense that, on the whole, we pursue what it is that we want to do. But on many issues, public opinion polls tell us that people are quite unhappy. They want to see progress. It's not that they can't deal with their lives if the policies don't change. But they feel Hong Kong is not going forward, if we can't solve some of these problems.
Questions, anyone? Doug Spellman.
Hello, Christine. Doug Spellman, Woodrow Wilson Center, but lived in Hong Kong for a number of years. I was sort of interested in the way you said, which I think we all agree, Hong Kong is an executive-led government. But Beijing's intention is to move toward direct elections for the chief executive rather than for LegCo, or before LegCo. Why wouldn't it be the other way around? If LegCo is in fact less influential, you would think that they would move in that direction first and then to the chief executive. Is there some explanation that I'm missing here?
It's easier to control the chief executive than to control 60 or perhaps in the future more members of the legislature. So therefore, if you could have an election system where who could be a candidate could be controlled, that would be a better system, I think, from Beijing's point of view, than allowing a legislature to have that legitimacy that it can claim, and it runs the risk of it being able to claim a greater legitimacy than the executive. So it's better to give the executive that ultimate legitimacy to say he was voted in by the people, but control the process for who can stand for election. And it'll be very interesting to watch here. As I said earlier on, I think by watching what happens in Hong Kong and Macau, the rest of the world can have a better understanding of some of these issues that top Chinese leaders have to struggle with. I mean, this is a corner in China, Hong Kong and Macau, where as a matter of national policy will probably lead the national way to have elections. And whilst China has experimented with village elections and inner party elections, to experiment in Hong Kong, it's still a very, very major step for the leaders in Beijing. So I think for people who are interested in studying the mindset, the steps and the considerations Beijing will give to evolving elections in Hong Kong, it really is a fascinating space to watch and study. Yes.
Gene Martin with Asia Pacific Strategies, now formerly of Hong Kong as well. Couple questions linked together, if you will. One is that do you see that Beijing could ever get to the point, as you were saying in your remarks, of perhaps using Hong Kong as an experimental laboratory, as they have previously with Guangdong? And secondly, that if they do that with elections, do they see that perhaps Hong Kong elections would have an undue influence across the border into Guangdong itself, particularly in South China?
I think Beijing will be very careful in both designing the election system and determining a time frame for when that can go ahead. And it will lean on the side of caution. If they develop a way of dealing with elections in urban Hong Kong, then perhaps that system could be then introduced into a part of the mainland. Now, I remember maybe about 4 or 5 years ago, there was some talk about whether Shenzhen could experiment a little bit more with some kind of election. But that fell by the wayside. So can we foresee that in the next, let's say, 15 years, that a corner of China like Shenzhen might be allowed some kind of experiment? And of course, if that were to happen, how that might, the trajectory of changing Chinese domestic politics, how that might be the case. be very interesting to watch. In December of last year, the NDRC, which is one of the key body generating institutions in Beijing, came up with a plan called the Outline Strategic Development Plan for the Pearl River Delta. And it focuses on industrial transformation of that area. So you also now see some new ideas coming from the mainland. And this has very much to do with an environmental cleanup. Is it possible to use the Pearl River Delta area as the beginning of industrial transformation, again using Hong Kong, and through Hong Kong, obviously, international cooperation as well in that area? In this plan, it also talked about administrative reform. Now, this has nothing to do with electoral reforms, not political reform, but administrative reform. And the area where they talked about administrative reform is the area that is least specific. It is least specific, but we know what they're referring to. They're referring to cleaning up the Chinese administrative system so that it's less corrupt, it's more efficient, and so on. So for China, I think it has a long way to go to offer administrative reform than the kind of political reform that is usually what is discussed in the West. I mean, China can go a long way to clean up its administration, to gain the support of the people without going into the kind of political reform that is often talked about in the West. So this collaboration of the Pearl River Delta area, where Hong Kong and Macau will play also a very important role, this gives you a framework to actually watch that integration. It will still be one country, two systems, but how will that integration take place? How will Hong Kong want to take advantage of the challenge of industrial transformation across the border? The second phase, right? The first phase was in 1980. We relocated there. The next phase, it's quite clear. You've got to go technologically upscale and you've got to clean up. Now, if that were to happen, what does that mean for Hong Kong and China as a whole? What would be some of the technology that will be used there? What would be the collaborative opportunities with the U.S.? As U.S. and China now dance with each other on climate change, where both sides have certain common principles of improving energy efficiency, of creating low carbon economies, to what extent will the U.S. and China be able to collaborate in regions of China for that to be, implemented? Can you conceive that Hong Kong and Shenzhen, for example, could be one of those pilot areas?
Two unrelated or relatively unrelated questions. My name is Michael Martin from Congressional Research Service. The first one, when you look at the dynamic, I'd ask you to look at the dynamics within what's often called the Hong Kong government, and in particular the role of the career civil service. There's some indications of changes in Hong Kong policy in recent years, like the appointment of permanent secretaries, that sort of indicate a bit of a schism or a split between the chief executive and this elite that you refer to, and the career civil servants. So I was wondering if you could comment on that. And then in light of the time frame that we're meeting today, if you had any thoughts or comments about June 4th, the 20th anniversary, what will happen in Hong Kong, and with respect to that, also what Beijing may be worried will happen in Hong Kong?
Okay. Let me talk about the civil service first. The major change took place in 2002 when our former chief executive, Tung Chee-hwa, decided to put in place a ministerial system. I I think without going into too much detail, I just want to say that by creating, well, the reason he wanted to do that was because he believed he could have better control. This notion that the Hong Kong government lacks legitimacy, it's one that has stayed with it all this time. We haven't found a way to solve this problem. And Mr. Tung at the time believed that if he could just have the key politicians, the key policymakers, to work closely with him, that he was going to appoint them, that was going to help a lot, because he saw the civil service as people who were standing in the way. They argued with him, about policy. This notion that a civil service should be independent, independent in the sense that it is there to serve whoever is in government, it doesn't work in a Chinese context. The mechanism that was developed in the West to deal with that is to say you have a neutral, right, politically neutral civil service that can give independent advice, whoever is in power. As I said, it doesn't work under the Chinese system. So the advice that was offered at times was not appreciated. So that meant the perception that if I could only have people who agreed with my policy, I would be a stronger government. Now, so that's the reason for changing the system to a ministerial system. Where are we today? So again, the judge of that is, are we getting better policies? And there's a lot of argument in Hong Kong whether that is the case or not. Now, but of course, having changed the system, you also change how civil servants see themselves, how they function within, within the political structure. And I think this is an issue that has created a lot of muttering. There are some figures that we don't have that may offer us some insight if we had them. How many civil servants, those not close to retirement but younger ones, what's the resignation rate? At what levels are they resigning? Can we get some, is it possible to poll them? Very difficult, obviously, as to really why they left. What's the level of frustration that they are feeling? Because we hear this all the time from people in government. It's a sign, again, of disconnect, of not having had, again, a public debate about how we see the civil service. Does it still work to have a neutral civil service? The idea of neutrality, does it still work? Or does it not apply anymore? Your second question about June 4th is, probably there's going to be, I think, a high turnout rate of Hong Kong people, because this is the 20th year. Hong Kong people have spent pretty much every year commemorating this event. For people of my generation and older who were there at the time, this remains an indelible memory. And in some ways, I think people in Hong Kong feel that that moment in time, so much a part of our own growing up, our own political maturity, that we're there to commemorate our own development as a society. So I think this year probably will have a big turnout because it's the 20th year. I'm not sure, however, that Beijing is necessarily uncomfortable with it, because, of course, we've had many commemorations. They're essentially peaceful. They're essentially heartwarming in a way. Or that's how it's perceived and reported in Hong Kong. And I think the media has no interest to not report it in a reasonably objective and sympathetic way. So I don't think this is going to bring about any of the kind of instability that we need to worry about.
Christine, can I abuse my authority here and ask a follow-on question? On the mainland, there are some young people who know about Tiananmen and still care about what happened then. But lots of young people in China don't know anything about it, or have heard very little about it. Is this something that's in the curriculum in Hong Kong? Is contemporary China treated in the curriculum in the schools in Hong Kong? If you don't know, that's fine. But if
I don't know. I don't know. It's probably still too contemporary.
yes, please.
Even though you said you don't talk about Taiwan or Tibet, but I'm going to ask you, since Ma Ying-jeou probably speak better Mandarin than you do.
Oh, he definitely does.
Okay. So what do you think, if he asked you for your advice, what should we do if, Taiwan should become one country, two systems? What kind of advice would you give him? And what kind of advice would you give China how to solve the corruption problem? 2 questions. Thank you.
I think the corruption problem is we need the rule of law in China. And we need a rule of law system that is where it's possible for the party and the government to be taken to task where necessary. This is still a very big step for the leaders in Beijing. So what we see in China is better laws, better rule by law that doesn't necessarily extend to the party system as yet. So we have to see how that evolves in China. There's a lot of discussion, interesting discussion in China itself on the further development of law. And again, that's a very important space to watch. About the Taiwan, I love listening to Ma Ying-jeou. He came to Hong Kong one year to when he won to be mayor of Taipei. He came to bai piao. He came to thank the people who could vote in Taiwan, because there's obviously a large group of such people in Hong Kong. He came to bai piao, and I was fortunate enough to be invited to listen to his speech. I mean, gosh, if I could speak like that. The thing about, I think, Taiwan Chinese is it's a very polite, beautiful form of Chinese. It's different from the way that Chinese is spoken in Hong Kong, and it's different from the Chinese that is spoken on the mainland. So I think, for one thing, is will the mainland Chinese, if they ever have a chance to listen to Ma Ying-jeou speak Chinese to them, directly to them, will they be spellbound, like we are spellbound in Hong Kong? I don't think I have any advice for Ma Ying-jeou. I mean, he is much more schooled and tutored in mainland affairs than we are. One thing about Taiwan that I never forget when I go there is, it's how Taiwan life for all these decades has been so much tied in with China. That when we were growing up in Hong Kong, as a colony, mainland China was a blank. And I think it is for us in Hong Kong to really catch up, to really learn about mainland politics, because whether we like it or not, we can't reject mainland politics. We've got to get into it. And the questions that I was trying to raise to see how do we take on mainland politics so that we can find our place in the sun within the mainland system, so that we can assert ourselves, so that we can get our ideas in there. That's much more important for us. We have no advice to offer to Ma Ying-jeou.
Christine, Ming Xingpei with Carnegie Endowment. First, a little comment on your intriguing proposition that the Communist Party in Hong Kong should come above ground. It also the party has a very tricky legal status inside China. It is a party that has no legal registration, even though it is the ruling party. So I think if it decides to register in Hong Kong, it naturally raises the issue of its legal status inside China. And how do you deal with that little problem? But this is just a little anecdote, because a friend of mine raised this issue in China and he got into trouble. I want to ask you about another thing. That
Well,
is
maybe this is where China can come out first in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
The party can first come out in Hong Kong.
No, because once you have a party law in China, then people will want to apply to get official registration. And how can you register the Communist Party without registering another pro-democracy party? But the question I want to raise is regarding the learning capacity of the Chinese Communist Party. The party has been credited as a learning organization. So I want to press you on three aspects of learning where Hong Kong is concerned, how Beijing dealt with Hong Kong. Is that, can you cite an area or a set of behavior that shows Beijing has learned and actually adapted accordingly? A second area that Beijing has learned the lesson, but because of political constraints, it still acts the same way. And the third area is simply is incapable of learning or understanding Hong Kong.
That's a very difficult set of questions for me to answer on my feet. It's definitely a very interesting question, but let me try. I think it does have learning capacities, obviously. For example, it was willing to allow Alan Leung to go ahead with the election against the chief executive. I see that as helpful for the party system because it gives it the chance to see what it is like. It's not something that it is something that they had experienced directly. So I think that was a learning experience for many people. I think that's the other point I want to make. Just because it may be a learning opportunity for the party, it doesn't mean it isn't for everybody else, where there's a co-learning experience. The second thing is that it has learned, but it can't do anything about it. Maybe some political bargains that it has to make in terms of elections, where to put people and so on. Maybe, too, because sometimes when I listen to mainland officials, I hear their frustration about what they can't do. They'd like to clean up corruption. I mean, there's certain things that we know they want to do, but they can't do it. And I think in Hong Kong as well, if you put the political system within the constraints that has been designed and built, the functional election systems, I don't think necessarily that the party in Hong Kong likes all the people that they have to deal with. But that's the system. Can't change it, so you have to accept it. Now, is the party incapable of changing? Probably need you to narrow down that a little bit, right? Because I've already answered that I think it's possible to learn. But are there certain systemic issues? It's part of the DNA. You just can't change the DNA. Maybe we would have to talk about the construction of the party and whether it can change. And I'm not talking specifically about the mainland. I think we need to look at the party as a whole. Then you need to look at how the party works, what are the key metabolic functions of the party, the United Front, the propaganda department, how it all fits in together. Do we need to change that system? Now, obviously, it's very difficult for us to have that debate in Hong Kong, but sometimes we get a glimpse of that by reading some of the party scholars in terms of what they argue about, how the party should evolve. And I guess the only point that I'm qualified to make here really is I read a lot of that with great interest myself, because I do think some of those strands of debate in China are, first of all, very important for us who are part of the Chinese system now to understand and learn. What are they talking about? What are they thinking about? How will the party evolve? Secondly is I do recommend some of these things to a wider audience. They can be quite difficult because it's essentially all in Chinese. But for a specialist group, I presume trying to digest that would be a lot easier than for the general audience outside China.
We have time for one final question. Jack Garrity.
Jack Garrity, Asia Society. You've raised a number of very provocative issues here today, and I have a two-part question. One, here we are 12 years after reunification. Has there been any discussion among Hong Kong leaders to maybe sit down with Chinese leaders and have a review and talk about some of these issues? Membership in the Politburo, for example, is one. And second, if you were to become chief executive, how would you map the road forward for Hong Kong?
I think there are reviews. There are probably quite regular reviews because, for example, our chief executive has to travel on duty visit to China a number of times a year. So I think he has high-level discussions. Exactly how the reviews are done, the documents that goes backwards and forwards and the conversation, unfortunately, there isn't any information that comes out that gives us an insight into that. Secondly is, what would I do if I were in government? I think I'd certainly look for all possible ways to get Hong Kong people appointed to mainland bodies. And I think there are different ways of doing this that isn't politically threatening. China has numerous bodies today where they appoint even foreigners to sit on them to give advice. Those bodies are very interesting because, of course, it's also a window for the outside appointees to get a sense of how the mainland may be thinking about important issues, whether this is about the environment, whether this is about the financial problems, and so on. If I were the chief executive, I would look at a lot of those committees where foreigners are allowed to sit. So, it's not inserting ourselves yet into the mainland system. And the mainland participants are usually very high-level people. They are very often at least vice ministerial levels, if not higher. So I think if Hong Kong can get a few of its own people appointed to those bodies, obviously I think the government would have to promote them and argue for their appointment. This could be a way for Hong Kong people to learn more about the mainland system and to get a chance to input our ideas into the system. So this is one of the early things that I can do that may be less controversial than anything else. I think it will be very hard to get a Hong Kong appointee onto the Politburo because, first of all, they'll have to acknowledge they're a member of the Communist Party.
Well, Christine, thank you very much. We 12 years ago, and just before and just after 1997, the issue on the surface of every discussion table was, will China keep its promises? Will it allow press freedom? Will it withhold its heavy hand from Hong Kong? And today, the agenda now seems to have shifted to how will Hong Kong influence China, which I think was the discussion topic below the table around 1997, but only among the people who had a sense of the potential for what Hong Kong would do to change the China that surrounds it. Thank you very much. Thank you all for coming today.